Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me today is Derrick Broze to discuss the update on the fluoride trial, the fluoride lawsuit, and the amazing work by the Fluoride Action Network and Michael Connett, and pretty much what you've already known if you've been watching this platform, along with a lot of other independent media out there for a very long time. In fact, the reality of the neurotoxin that is fluoride and how it's been put into your water for nobody's interest other than the government and the people that they're paying to do that for. And so Derrick has been really up on this from the beginning of an NTP report that was breaking down how dangerous this was. And the report has finally come out. Grudgingly, I would argue the government's been trying to resist this. Again, as you know, you've been following his work on this, and also some discussion around some other political dynamics. Derrick, it's good to see you today. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me back on.
It's pretty, it's one of those I told you so moments that we're going to try to avoid diving into the whole entire show, right? The idea that it's like, so, the funny part for those that haven't been watching this so far is that this has been something that Derrick has really championed and has been highlighting that this has been known. And again, this before even this report came up, it's also important to highlight that one of those conspiracy theorists were right. And the term really being, obviously we should be talking about who was conspiring to manipulate us, but they've been aware of the danger of fluoride for a very long time. Then the report and the dynamic around this report comes into play, and you immediately picked up on this, and you've been ringing the bell around how the report was, what it was building toward, what Michael Connett and his network were fighting for. And then we got to the point where the report was shown because essentially they argued that it was right to come out, and the government stepped in, and every angle of it, the CDC, the NIH, the EPA, all stepping in to try to stop this from happening. My point is that at that point, Americans in the world should have already known about this. If there was an honest dynamic in the media sphere today, right? Because you were ringing that bell. It was all there. You even highlighted how they were actively trying to suppress that, and it still may end up going that direction. So today we're going to go from the point where the report has officially been released. And this is showing everything Derrick's already highlighted, all the information that's there. Actually, I would argue, and you'll speak to this, it's wildly being downplayed, if not completely misrepresented by corporate media and the whole 2 times the amount conversation. But so why don't you give us an update on this point forward? So the report's out. What's happening next? What's your thoughts on the report? And so, and what manipulations are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you for that, Ryan. So as you mentioned, anybody who's followed my reporting at TLAV for the last 4 years has been aware of these concerns and these claims about fluoride lowering IQ in children, because actually I started working with TLAV in May 2020, and one of the first series of articles I did was on the first phase of the fluoride lawsuit, the fluoride trial, in the summer of 2020. You guys may remember that this was COVID lockdown, so the whole trial was virtual, but I attended it virtually via Zoom, and we were doing live tweeting and just documenting everything that was going on back then. And already the claims were being made about the impact on IQ and neurodevelopment for children. And we had previous studies going back to 2006, like the National Research Council, that were pointing at this, but we didn't quite know how much evidence there actually was. And this we only found out is because of this lawsuit between the Fluoride Action Network and the US EPA, because after the 2020 phase of the first phase of the trial was put on hold by Judge Edward Chin, he basically said, we know there's some more reports coming out, including this national toxicology report coming out. So let's just put everything on hold. Let's wait till that comes out before we go further. And that actually took a whole nother 4 years. So at the end of summer 2020, when the judge put everything on hold, the trial didn't resume again till February of this year in San Francisco in the courtroom. And you guys may remember I was there for 2 weeks reporting for TLAV and interviewing the expert witnesses, including Dr. Philippe Grandjean, Dr. Bruce Lanphier, and Michael Connett, the lead attorney for the Fluoride Action Network. And as part of this lawsuit between 2020 to 2024, emails were released in the discovery process. Michael and his team were filing to get access to any emails they could between the CDC, specifically the CDC's Oral Health Division, and the Department of Health and Human Services. And they obtained numerous emails, which we reported on. I was calling them the fluoride emails. And even back then we were saying, why is this not bigger news, not only in the corporate media, but in the alternative media? Because they were pretty big bombshells in there. And what it showed was that the scientists at the NTP, Dr. Mary Wolf specifically, and a few others, told the U.S. government, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the director of the NTP that their report was ready. They said they were ready to publish this May 18th, 2022. So more than 2 years ago, these emails show that the scientists said, our conclusions are set. We reviewed the CDC's comments and we think we're still ready to go. And the CDC and the anonymous peer reviewers' comments at the time were trying to get the scientists at the NTP to downplay their conclusions. They kept wanting to add caveats and things like you mentioned, like, oh, well, it's twice the recommended limit, or this doesn't apply to the US population, things like that, because they realize that if people hear about this, they're obviously going to connect it to their own water supply in the United States. And the scientists, as these emails show, numerous times rejected those conclusions and said, our data shows what we have written here, that fluoride is associated with lower IQ in children. There's no need to add based on higher exposures or these different terms. And those emails also showed that the director of the NTP, Richard, I can't remember his last name right now, but it's in my article, as well as Rachel Levine of the Assistant Secretary of Health in the U.S. government. Both of them are listed in these emails as having blocked the release of this report more than 2 years ago. So we've been reporting on that. And then, as I said, the trial resumed in February, and Judge Chin did allow the draft version of the report to be brought into the discussion. And so much of the second phase of the trial was all about the draft version. But of course, we still didn't have the final version. And this allowed the government attorneys at the time to basically try to downplay it. Every time the Fluoride Action Network would reference the NTP report, the government would then respond, you know, Your Honor, this is just a draft version of the report. It's not the final conclusion. We shouldn't take it seriously, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now that final version of this report, which has been the most peer-reviewed report ever in the National Toxicology Program's history, gone through more than 5 different peer review process, which is highly unusual. And as I said, no other report has had to go through this much scrutiny. And numerous, agencies getting involved. And we also know that the report was leaked to the American Dental Association, which is one of the major fluoride lobbyist groups, and that they were told about this before the public was even told about it. And now that report has come out. And although, as I reported in my article, some of the kind of language to attempt to downplay it was included, and my guess is that was included because the government said, we're not going to release this unless you add higher fluoride exposure, things like that, right. Which again are meant to downplay the impact and make it seem as like, oh, this doesn't apply to me. Because for those who don't know, the US government currently, the CDC, they currently recommend 0.7 milligrams per liter of fluoride in the water. The WHO, World Health Organization, recommends 1.5 milligrams per liter. And some of these studies do indeed look at that 1.5 level, but also, as the scientists say, deep in this 324-page report, they even mention, and I quote from them in the article, they say something to the effect of, this does apply to some children in U.S. communities, because as we've talked about in previous reports, Ryan, it's not just the water that you're being exposed to. Like right. If you're drinking water, it's if you're cooking with fluoride, if you're making your coffee in it, processed foods contain fluoridated water, the shower, et cetera, toothpaste, et cetera. So you have these numerous methods of exposure, and that obviously leads up to a more cumulative impact effect. So it's not that the average person who is showering, drinking, cooking, eating processed foods, brushing their teeth with fluoride is only getting that 0.7 milligrams per liter. In reality, they're being exposed at much higher levels. So this absolutely applies to the U.S. population. But
And I should add, from your work, right, we've already seen multiple times that the experts have pointed out that this is dangerous basically at any level. And all on top of that, the amount that you're seeing in some locations in the U.S. in just the water alone reaches over that limit in certain places in the country. Or the point you're making is that, without question, all the different sources combined almost guarantees that people are going over this on a regular basis. And then to add, as you mentioned, the 6 different times, like we have to make sure that a large story that we need to highlight in and of itself, which you've already done, outside of the fluoride conversation, is that simply the government was in a very dishonest way trying to keep this from your view. As simple as that. And that, I mean, it's amazing that that's not almost illegal. Like, this should be highlighted after the fact. Like, why were you going to such lengths to stop this from being seen? I think the answer is obvious, right? And so all that combined, to me, simply shows the same thing I've been saying about this, that this entire time your government has been actively fighting to keep something in your water that they know is dangerous. And based on all the evidence that it's a no-brainer that this is going to make the reach that level on a regular basis. And then lastly, that the actual positive effects that they claim that they're even there for is a part that we need to start chipping away at even more. it's not correct, as you know, and you've just discussed, and whether it helps your teeth. It's based on a lie to begin with. So even the idea that, well, it's okay under this level, well, why is it there in the first place? So this work has become very important. So where do you see this going from this point? And I want to get in after this to like all the different conversations around it. But so Judge Chen has yet to make a ruling on this. Am I understanding that correctly? Is that about to happen soon?
Yeah, so he has not ruled on this, and you're correct, Ryan, just to touch on what you just said, that absolutely the lie that we've been told since the beginning, and that unfortunately even some people who recognize the dangers of fluoride still hold on to this idea that fluoride is good for fighting cavities. It does harden your teeth, just like it hardens your bones as well inside your body when it washes through your entire body. But it's not good for remineralization. It does not fight cavities. And I reported on this a couple months ago that the UK is actually, they just commissioned a really big report. I can't remember the name off it off the top of my head, but it's in my previous articles. And because now the UK is considering fluoridating the entire country, as well as Canada. You have a few different major populations in the UK and Canada who are doing this, but not nationwide. Both countries are considering doing this nationwide, and the UK commissioned a report, and their own report found negligible impacts to cavities, or what are sometimes known as caries, dental caries. So even in the government's own data, and we've known this for decades now, I've been reporting on this for more than a decade, that this whole cavity thing is BS, and it doesn't stand up. At best, it's a very minimal impact, or it's negligible, where there's really no noticeable difference. So that is important to continue to debunk that myth. And in terms of the actual fluoride trial, I do want to quote from the scientists in just a moment, but I want to read to you and to the audience here. I shared this online, but I'd like to just quote from it directly. I was notified by Michael Connett, who's the lead attorney for the Fluoride Action Network, and he told me that as soon as this report was published, I actually do quote him in my article. We added a quote from him. He told me that the judge notified both him and the other side, the U.S. government, and told them basically that if they have any statements to make as far as, here we go, here's the exact thing. So after the study came out, they got this order from the court, and it says this specifically: the court has been made aware that the NTP monograph was recently published. The parties are invited to file the published version of this document and a joint letter identifying whether the published version is meaningfully different from the pre-publication version reviewed by this court at trial, and if so, specifically identifying these differences. The filing is due by this coming Wednesday, signed Judge Edward Chin. So basically what that means is, in the February version, like I mentioned a couple moments ago, the judge did allow the draft pre-publication version to be discussed. And so he's clearly aware this new report came out, and he's basically telling the government and the Fluoride Action Network, if there's anything different from the pre-publication version to the final version that you want to make note of, they're going to file a joint document and submit it to the court by this coming Wednesday. And I did ask Michael Connett directly, do you believe this means the judge is getting ready to make a ruling? And he said, yes, absolutely. So I think that we're finally getting to the point where we might be really close to getting a ruling. And it could be that the judge was waiting for the NTP version to come out. And I could speculate, a little bit as to what I think that means as far as the judge's thinking. I mean, I don't know if Michael Connett is going to file a joint letter and say if there's anything, quote unquote, meaningfully different from what he's already, brought to trial. But I would assume, based on what I saw in court and how the government has treated this whole thing, that they are going to seize upon those caveats that I mentioned, twice the recommended limit, higher fluoride exposure, et cetera, and try to tell the judge, see, look, the final version says they have moderate confidence, which might not sound like much to the average person, but that's actually a pretty strong statement in terms of scientific. They don't ever come out and say, like, this is poisoning people. They're going to couch it in these very conservative terms. Moderate confidence is actually quite a big step, but I guarantee you the government's going to try to say, look, they only have moderate confidence, not high confidence in these. And they said that, it's at the twice the recommended limit. It's above what we currently allow. And I've already kind of seen the statements. I've been searching the mainstream to see how the fluoride defenders are spinning this. And you've already got some of the spokesmen from the American Dental Association. They're acknowledging that there's harm. Obviously, they can't ignore it anymore. It's in the final version of the report. But they're basically saying, the statement I saw was, well, this means the EPA should consider whether or not they want to, because although the current level is 0.7, there still are on the books statements and references and recommendations that say 1.5 like the WHO. So what I think they're going to do is just try to say, okay, well, we should lower that recommendation down to 1.0, but still, make the argument that, but since we're at 0.7, everything's fine. This doesn't impact people. And as I just outlined a moment ago, we know that that's completely garbage. But I expect that that's the argument they're going to make. Nevertheless, that gives them till this Wednesday, and I'm sure we'll hear some update after that. My guess would be the judge gets the filing. He takes a week or two to review it, and then he's going to probably set a court date for the final, his final announcement, his ruling. And I know that we've been talking about this since February, and I'm getting emails still on a weekly basis. Derrick, what happened to the fluoride ruling? Has anything happened? So I would like to believe that we should see a ruling in September because we're near the end of August here. But ultimately, none of us really know. But hopefully with this new report coming out and with the scientists themselves saying fluoride exposure is, quote, consistently associated with lower IQ in children. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they even add in there, however, because people receive fluoride from multiple sources, not just drinking water, individuals living in areas with optimally fluoridated water can have total fluoride exposures higher than the concentration of their drinking water. And then they continue, this indicates that the moderate confidence in the inverse association between fluoride exposure and children's IQ is relevant to some children living in the United States. I'm hoping and I'm praying that that means that we are very close to seeing the end of water fluoridation in the United States. But we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing is, it's hard for me to have a positive outlook on, Judge Chen, as we pointed out in a couple interviews, has made a couple movements throughout this process that gives me at least the slight hope that he may go in a positive direction with this. But I'm just, for how many times we've been, our hope's been dashed around this, it's hard for me to think that anything, I think the positive, as we've said before, is simply that this happened already, that people have seen this, that the report's out there, the science is there. The government, as they've been doing this entire time, is going to do its best to maintain this for its own interests. And I think that's kind of where this is going to go. And even if they make a ruling, as you said, they've left open all these caveats for this. The bottom line is this is a dangerous substance that's being put in your water for something other than health. And I think the evidence, I forget the doctor's name, but one of your interviews, I think it was the one that used to work with the WHO. His point was that this is dangerous. And the idea is that if at any level, or if this is hurting you, the point is, and I make this point with any substance, just because they argue here's the level we decide that it means it's dangerous, there's still, it's a substance that has an effect on your body. And the idea that we can prove that this is higher in certain levels just in the water, let alone with all the overlaps, it kills me that we have to go through this process, especially as we're talking about other things in our, things like dioxins and PFAS, things that have been there for so long that they're even producing, that the government is aware that they're adding to the situation, and even recently said we don't care. We're not going to abide by the necessity to stop doing this because we need it for national security. I guess what I'm saying is just that it's hard for me to feel that anything is going to change on their side. But I think this is kind of the way of the world today, right? That we, as the individuals, again, this is kind of the perfect, I don't even want to segue yet, but it's kind of the perfect discussion for the next thing we're going to talk about, that I'm tired of people acting like, as I'm sure you are as well, that we need some kind of higher authority to dictate how we can live our lives. This is enough for us to decide that we need to make this change, whether that means going to places that don't allow this or putting your in support and money and with groups that are actively trying to fight this. That's the direction we need to be taking. And I'm sure you agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm totally with you in terms of our hopes having been dashed numerous times. And for some reason, there's still some part of me, at least in terms of the fluoride case here, that is hoping and believing that maybe there will be a positive outcome. And maybe that's my own naivete, wishing for something positive in this world of craziness that we're going to get into in just a few moments. But I do think that overall, in terms of, and I've said this in previous interviews, in terms of the judicial system, as corrupted as we all know it is, as flawed as we know it is, if that system's going to exist, you would want a judge like Judge Edward Chen, based on what I've witnessed in the last 4 years, both via Zoom and in person in the courtroom, who has the appearance at least, and who acts as if they are truly interested in objective knowledge, trying to understand the science. I've talked about that in previous interviews, that we're dealing with some pretty complex topics. Like on the surface level, fluoride's bad. Yeah, that's it. But when you really get into it, you have all these different these terms, margin of exposure, point of departure, et cetera. And as I told you in previous interviews, and I did my best to sort of explain in the articles I've written without getting too deep in the weeds, it's a pretty complex topic for if you're truly trying to get to the bottom of it. Yes, on the surface level, most of us, we know fluoride's bad. But for a judge, he's not just going to take that and say, okay, fluoride's bad, rule against it, right? He wants to get into the nitty gritty and try to truly understand that. I think he did his best to understand that. I think that he's waiting on this report to make sure that it was in the public, because let's say he ruled before this report did become the final version, and then behind the scenes, these scientists end up getting shifted over towards the conclusion that fluoride's safe. Well, then the judge had just, I guess he would look bad, or he would look silly for making this ruling. And then if the government comes out and says, never mind, fluoride's safe. So I think he was waiting for this final version to come out. It's now out. It's now making mainstream news, which is great. Unfortunately, they're still ignoring the bigger picture of the fact that the report has been covered up for so many years. Like, I don't think anybody in the corporate media even touched on that angle. And people who've been following us know that that's the truth, that this report was kept from people for several years. And at the same time, we also know that that we can point to certain U.S. officials that did prevent the release of this report. I mentioned Rachel Levine, Richard Tabak, I think is his name at the NTP Office of Director. And that is a big thing. And not only that, the part that I feel, I guess, good about, and that I did include in my latest article here for TLAV, is that the scientists at the NTP, at least the names that we know, and these are not famous people who are out there doing podcasts. They're just scientists in the NTP chugging away, doing the good work.
Oh, did we lose you? Well, I'll add something in hopes that you come back here in a second. I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure. I'll let you finish your point when you come back. But what I was going to add a second ago is about your point about the idea of having hope about this. Is that I want to make it clear that because we were off air before, we were talking about the idea of being black-pilled and how people can perceive that as kind of some of the things we're discussing today.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'll finish what I was saying, just since I was kind of just jumping in for a second. I was going to add that, you mentioned the idea of being the hope around it, and the point about like being black-pilled and it being perceived that way. But I think the important part is that like this is a very hopeful situation. And the idea is that ultimately we're in a place where the people are making the change happen. People like Michael Connett, like this is a grassroots kind of action. And I think that's the hope we need to see in that. I think it's almost in a way naive to think that the government itself is going to make this change. We know that's not going to be the reality. So I wouldn't call it black-pilled or like lacking hope to see that they're who they are, right? That's just acceptance, I think. But we need to lean into the people that are actually making change, which is you, the people out there, Michael Connett, that kind of thing. Anyway, go ahead and finish your point. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to, with the point I was making is that I just want people to understand that there are I know that in the last few years, COVID times, it's become very easy to the mainstream says we're anti-science, and I don't think that label applies to us. But I do think at the same time, there are some people who have got to the point of just not trusting anything, which, is understandable on one level. But to me, looking at this case and knowing that there are scientists within the National Toxicology Program, because of these emails, we see like Dr. Mary Wolf is one of them. And what I was saying is these are not famous scientists on podcasts. These are just people behind the scenes who have been fighting to preserve their conclusions. They pushed back against the NTP. They pushed back against the CDC. They pushed back against all these different people and said, our conclusions are set. We believe in what we found. And again, they wanted this report to come out in May 2022, and then again in September 2022. Well, here we are in August 2024, and it's finally come out. But I just want people to understand that. I don't think that all scientists are bad. All people within the science fields are corrupted, et cetera. I know it can sometimes feel that way. But this is one example that there are people within there truly trying to do the real science and stick to the data and make sure that the public knows about it. And it's only because of these corrupted officials that it took so long for us to find out about it.
And I'll add to that too. This is a point that I make often, the idea that, the mantra of question everything, it doesn't mean dismiss everything, right? It means question everything while entertaining all possibilities. And if you actually embody that or, lean into that idea, it's, it matters whether you, like, let's say, know somebody's lied in the past or whether an industry is corrupted. But ultimately, it's only a data point you add. You still look at what they're saying, consider it, research it, try to prove it, right? It's a vessel for information as opposed to that person being the information. And so the point you're making about like just people, overreacting, or rather the kind of I guess that's the right word, just going to go into too far in that direction. Like, we should have a very clear skepticism. We should have, before all of this, just genuinely questioning what they're saying, whether or not they're on your side or whatever. The point is, now we see more of a reason to be skeptical of them, but we should still consider what they're saying. To just dismiss because a doctor said we shouldn't listen to doctors, I mean, that's just as willfully ignorant as blindly accepting what they're saying. It's the same thing, right? As you're kind of highlighting. And so I think that's the problem, is that, you know, we have to be able to consider even somebody in the government. I mean, for example, something that I struggle with, just politicians. Like, if you're going to have a really hard time convincing me to listen, you know, to believe a politician has your best interest at heart. But sometimes what they say just happens to align with the truth. But my point, like a Thomas Massey, I'm increasingly seeing that he says things that I really agree with, and it's going to be a very hard process for me to ever believe that I can, you know, and I don't think I ever will again, quite frankly, but I'm still open to that possibility. Like, that's a really important thing we're dealing with here today with, you know, things like this. If we didn't continue to be open to the possibility of what this is showing, or just disregard all science, this would have never happened, you know, and this is an important step for us to possibly change something. So I completely agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. And just to kind of wrap up on that, I encourage people to just stay tuned, because at the moment that I hear there's a ruling, you can bet we'll have a report out on it, and there will be more to come, because this is one big report, and it's a landmark report, but there are still studies ongoing right now that I know of regarding fluoride. We will have more details, more information. And then, of course, this particular report is focused on neurodevelopment, which is obviously really important. But there's other data about liver, kidney problems, bone problems, hypothyroidism that we've reported on, pineal gland, et cetera. So this is a toxic substance that's really just it's a full-on assault on the human body. And anytime that I personally can point to a study or a piece of data that helps at least one more person stop drinking this, and I include my own family. You know, I'll just mention yesterday when I did my report on this, my younger brother was actually listening, and he reached out and said, "Great report." And then he told me that him and my stepdad have still been, despite them using filtered water to drink and these other things, they've still been cooking with the tap water. Now, finally, thankfully, they're going to stop now that he's kind of heard a little bit more information. But the point is, there's still more people just finding about this. I know that there's sometimes those of us who are jaded who are like, yeah, we knew about this 20 years ago, blah, blah. And that is true for many people. But there are still many people who this is completely new, or they bought into the propaganda that this was just a conspiracy theory. And the more data we have, the better we are able to reach people and to hopefully help them help themselves.
Exactly. And that's the point that we didn't necessarily mention today, I don't think, but this is, you know, general in all the work you've done thus far, that this whole idea of, and you might have said it, but the NTP report is based on a massive body of work, right? Like this is a what's the term for it again? In the scientific study, I'm blanking on the term.
It's a monograph.
But there's another term they use when, you know, they scooped up all the previous.
It's a systematic review.
Systematic review. Thank you. Of all the previous reports. And so all that shows you is that this is, and there's varying degrees, as you cover in your articles, about whether they think that they're, you know, up to standard or not, but how much it's like with the COVID discussion is how much is out there, peer reviewed and otherwise, going, yeah, this is dangerous. And yet it still has to be, you know, I mean, I'm all for the process, but if you're being objective about what we're seeing here with what would happen just with this NTP report, it's, as we've already shown very clear that they're actively trying to stop this. All I'm highlighting is that it goes a hell of a long time before this where we've already known this and they still just don't care, you know? So it's, again, going to be about the individual process. And like you just showed, reaching your family, making sure they understand this, choices in our lives to stop this from happening. And eventually, if we can turn this to a point to where there are going to be politicians that see an opportunity in leaning in with the mass adoption, that's when the change happens. We're seeing that with Israel. We're seeing that with a lot of different things right now. That's where I'm starting to recognize the real political action happens, when we can just get enough momentum going to where you get politicians that realize it's in their best interest, whether they agree with it or not, to lean in with these kind of things. And that's what I see with a lot of Massey coming out, leaning into a lot of things. And again, I hope maybe he's being honest about it, but that's just how I think we need to start going about this, you know? So amazing work on all this. Any other points you want to leave on the fluoride side of this? Oh, actually, I did, before we go forward, and still, if you have any other points to add, I wanted to point out a couple things I saw online, which go into the kind of conversation about it. Small passing points. I just find it interesting that we're still seeing this kind of a game going on where somebody simply said, look, the fluoride reports come out, you know, that's saying, you know, they're making fun of him saying you probably have an IV drip of fluoride. And the person adds, it's not what the study says, and they reference the point about the twice the recommended amount. So you did mention that, but can you make a point about that again? Like, so is that exactly what it's saying in regard to the fact that it has to be twice the amount that's there? Or go back to the breakdown on that, because I understand it's not necessarily accurate to say that it has to be twice the amount that it's dangerous. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And that screenshot is a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about. And I talked about that in my article, because one of the most widely promoted articles that person's probably referring to is coming from the Associated Press. And if anybody knows about news wires like the Associated Press, they publish one thing and then that gets picked up by local news and other news and just kind of republished elsewhere. And it's like a shorthand for journalism. So if the news wires like Reuters or AP put it out, you can just post that on your website. You don't have to do your own research. And so the headline they went with was U.S. government report says fluoride at twice the recommended limit is linked to lower IQ in kids. And that's exactly what I was talking about a moment ago, that they want that's what the public to get, is that twice the recommended limit. So then they could say, oh, well, the U.S. government only recommends 0.7 milligrams per liter. This study doesn't actually apply, as that person was just there tweeting and trying to say.
Therefore meaning that it's safe the way it is, which isn't true.
And that's the obvious implication that they want to get across, that at the current level, then everything's fine. It's all good. But as I said, in this 324-page report, even though the scientists, because again, I'll read the scientists' own words, they say that they have moderate confidence that fluoride exposure, and they do say higher fluoride exposure, is consistently associated with lower IQ in children. And this is why I was making the point earlier, is that for the average person who has no idea, for one, that this report has been squashed and censored for 2 years, and that they don't understand that the peer reviewers and the conversation that I've covered in my past articles showing that the scientists were like, we're good, we're sticking with our conclusions, we reviewed what the CDC has to say, and we're still sticking with our conclusions. They don't have any of that background information. So they don't understand what went into getting to this point. And that's why I'm saying, I'm pretty sure it's that same peer review process that maybe they came to the science and said, look, we're not publishing this without these certain phrases in there, because people need to understand that how simple these language games can be played, because you can say things like could be, maybe, at this high level, higher exposure. There's certain little simple terms that they can add in, and all of a sudden it changes the whole structure of the sentence from being fluoride is associated with lower IQ in children to being higher fluoride exposure is associated with lower IQ in children with moderate confidence at levels twice the recommend. You start adding all these caveats, and then it waters down the statement. And before you know it, it gives people like that person there and like the AP and anybody who's reading their work to say, okay, well, yeah, you guys are kind of right. Fluoride is harmful. I guess that's not a total conspiracy, but it's not at the levels that we're actually consuming. So there's no reason to pay attention to this. Let's go on with our lives. But as I mentioned earlier, they say specifically, because people receive fluoride from multiple sources, individuals living in areas with optimally fluoridated water, and optimally fluoridated water is that 0.7 milligrams per liter, can have total fluoride exposures higher than the concentration of their drinking water. So that's what people need to pay attention to, is the total fluoride exposure, not simply the drinking water. This is what the American Dental Association and all the fluoride lobbyists and the U.S. government and the EPA and other people who, for whatever reason, feel the need to defend fluoride, that is what they would rather us focus on, is just this one source, drinking water. Okay, we're getting 0.7 milligrams per liter, and this study's focused on levels above that. But again, even the scientists in their own words, they say that they did look at studies that were, as I point out from the previous articles, that they did look at studies that included data at the current levels as well as levels below the currently recommended levels. So it's not just, every study they looked at was at 1.5 and plus, well beyond what the WHO recommends, well beyond what the CDC recommends. Sure, there were some studies where people were being exposed to fluoride at higher levels, but there's also studies where it's well below the currently recommended levels. And then again, if people can go back, if you really want to dive deep, go look at our previous interviews we've done when I was at the fluoride trial and the articles I did then, because there was a lot of discussion in the trial about that. And Michael Conant and his team were making the point, but it's not like at 1.5, all of a sudden harm just, we flick a light switch and everything starts happening. It's a cumulative effect. So there's impact well before you can even measure it. And then also I made the point, and Dr. Philippe Grandjean made the point during the trial, that with lead and with mercury, the EPA acted way before then. They saw that, hey, harm is happening from lead in the water, from mercury. But even though that was at higher levels, they still acted because of this principle, this I think they call it the uncertainty principle, or you can just say erring on the side of caution and thinking that, hey, what about the most vulnerable population, pregnant mothers, people with kidney issues who are going to be drinking more water. So they're going to be consuming way more than the recommended amount. And that, of course, goes into mothers who are by the third trimester, they're chugging lots of water to keep themselves hydrated as well as their baby. That's going straight into their body, straight into the placenta, passing the blood-brain barrier into the baby, into the children's brains. And that's where we're seeing these neurodevelopmental problems. So this whole thing about like it doesn't apply to our current standards and our current fluoride levels is bullshit. I mean, it's total garbage, and people need to. This is why I wrote my article in the way I did. I didn't just do here's the thing about the NTP report, but to kind of give some more background so that people are fully informed on what all went into this. Because as I said, if you just read the AP article, okay, you have no idea that this report has been in the background being hidden for 2 years. You have no idea that the scientists have been trying to fight for their conclusions to be maintained in the final version. And I'm guessing that it was probably based on the previous peer review statements that we saw in the emails, that it was probably a struggle for them to keep these statements in there. Yeah, they buried it 200 pages in. However, this still applies to the thing. But, you know, the headline that everybody's grabbing is just moderate confidence, higher fluoride exposure, et cetera. And that's what people are running with.
Right. The typical kind of Twitter files new journalism where it's just kind of regurgitation of simple talking points, you know, which has kind of always been the way it is, but it's on overdrive today. And I think that's the, so again, to clarify for those that are listening, it's not just, it's the accumulation of other sources, but as Derrick made very clear right there, it's also just dangerous in general, right? And I think that's what's being kind of buried with the way they're framing this. And so, you know, the idea of going over that limit, and the other third point actually I will add that is clear is that there's many other studies in the systematic review that do argue explicitly that it's dangerous under that level. And so these just kind of get swept under the rug with all of it, which is, you know, the kind of the process of this entire thing. But this is why it's important to act, you know, not to wait for some government figure to tell you it is or isn't bad or is okay or not, or say, you know, you make these decisions based on what you see. And so here's the last thing in this that I wanted to show, which is interesting, is that this is the last kind of hurdle for any stuff like this. So this is the technicals on YouTube. I'm not familiar with who it is, just simply saying, you know, look, this is happening. It says U.S. government report. You know, everyone's kind of showing this. It's circulating. This person says, is big fluoride in the room with you right now? You know, and so the idea that it's like, no matter what, ultimately, there will be people that will forever just be like conspiracy theory, right? And just dismiss the topic, like literally with geoengineering being like, not like a explicitly discussed and active process where we're doing this. Here's Harvard, here's our programs. And yet people will still like, oh, where's your tinfoil hat? You know, it's a weird, and you know, this also will overlap with the last part we'll talk about, that there's a very clear kind of cult mentality with a lot of these different things. And it's not even just left-right paradigm stuff. And it's very difficult to overcome, you know, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or not. It's just kind of like, this is the kind of one of the biggest battles of our time, is how you get past that mindset that is kind of not concerned with the facts. It's about where they've decided. And, you know, and this, they're going to keep giving it to their children. They're going to keep getting injections. They're going to keep doing the things because the government said so, you know, and that's a very difficult hurdle to get over. But I don't think it's the majority. But yeah, what's your thought on that?
Well, I think it does tie into the next topic in terms of just people who dig their heels in, whether it's about politicians or it's about vaccines or it's about fluoride, because I mean, I don't know. I don't know why. I can't claim to know why, because I guess I assumed ignorantly when I was younger that humans, and again, it's not all of us, so I'm not trying to paint the whole humanity in a broad brush here, but some of us are still capable of taking in new information, adjusting our views accordingly, and then, you know, okay, maybe I was wrong about this or whatever. I personally don't understand why people personalize it so much. Like, for example, if you're not working for a fluoride company or, you know, you're not a lobbyist, why is it so hard to just say, oh, wow, that's crazy. Oh, my God, look, new data. I need to adjust. I don't want to harm my kids. Instead, it's like some people, they act like they are part of the fluoride lobby. And I don't know. I mean, I will say this, I've touched on this in the past, that the fluoride lobby is extremely strong and they will show up. The American Dental Association will send representatives. For example, I've said in the past, when I went to city council a decade ago talking to people about fluoride, we had only 5 people there speaking about it. but we came a couple of weeks in a row. By the second and third week, American Dental Association officials somehow heard about it and showed up and were basically there to tell the city council, none of these people are dentists, none of these people are scientists, don't listen to them, they're all crazies. And it worked, it was effective. So there is that, and Dr. Philippe Grandjean also talked about it, as I reported previously, that the fluoride lobby had infiltrated the WHO, and whenever he was there working on that. So that does exist. So it's possible that there are people who literally just get paid to kind of go argue with people and downplay these circumstances. As for why regular average people would be so defensive, I really can't claim to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, and I think the way they personalized, as you said, I think that's interesting. And this comes back to, my opinion, the feeling that what you're doing is attacking what they perceive as the government they support. Right. Like I think it's this building, like obviously it's always kind of been there, and people more so for other reasons, I think in the past, dismissed or pushed back on it because they didn't want to be seen as the lunatic. Today, it's a little different, I think. And I think people are like very aggressively defending, kind of, I don't know, like whether some people kind of frame it as being like un-American, let's say, that you're like hurting the government at a time. These are all my opinions. Like, who's to know what their true intent is? But I get that sense that it really is about defending what they see as their side or their government. And I think that's an interesting point to make, that it's become the inverse of what the reality is. Like, this should be the other way around. It should be people pushing back on the government, not them defending them, as you try to point out that they're lying. It's such an interesting dynamic. I'll include that interview because I do think I'll include all these links, by the way, to the actual entire category of all the work he's done on fluoride. But that one in particular, Dr. Philippe Grandjean, have you said, exposes the history of fluoride's harms, the overlap with WHO. It's a great interview. It's very powerful. So I guess on that note in general, let's talk about, and just kind of a brief last conversation about this, because I'm sure this is something that's going to be ongoing. There's a lot around this that's going to develop. I think both Derrick and I were talking off air about this beforehand, about the kind of what we were just really highlighting, this problem that we're seeing, this growing dynamic around the cult kind of two-party paradigm that is, I mean, I don't think it's just us, Derrick. It's very clear people are pointing out there's something much more pronounced about it right now. And you've written a lot of great articles about this. And from at least from my perspective, and I think you agreed, the idea that this is a more illusion, right? Where you have powerful entities that are dictating, whether we're talking about the Bilderberg Group steering committee, or we're talking about Israel, or, whatever else it is, powerful entities that are abusing this divide, abusing the illusion of these two-party dynamic to keep us like mired in one position. Or I don't know, how do you view this? What are your thoughts on this whole dynamic?
I mean, I think you said it perfectly there. I mean, so I've been getting angry on social media lately, getting frustrated dealing with this, but it's because I really see, for those who tuned in, we had this really epic conversation with me, Ryan, James Corbett, and Aaron and Melissa at Truth Stream Media, Josh Sigurdson, and Dan Dix. And I encourage people to go watch that if you haven't. Hopefully we reach some people beyond, our own echo chamber, but in general, I feel like this is just a continuation of that. I started getting into independent media, this freedom movement, conspiracy movement, whatever you want to say, in late 2009, going into 2010. And one of the first things that I, learned, or that realized was kind of new to me, was like, oh, this two-party idea, it's actually a lie. This two-party paradigm, like you go back and forth. And it was really obvious to people back then, I think, because you had the George Bush era, Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, et cetera. And then Obama came in and made these big promises. We're going to go after them. We're going to hold them accountable, and immediately said it's time to look forward, not backwards. And then revealed himself to be even worse than the Bush, Bush kind of cabal, very similar in tactics and approach and everything. And I felt like that was really such a beautiful time, because people could clearly see both sides of the equation were full of it, were lying. And then even going into Romney, and people were like, oh, look, they're putting up Romney versus Obama. What's the big difference, right? And that to me was just such an obvious, a clear thing that so many of us could see. Like, once you got past the first layer of deception of realizing, okay, there's corruption in the world, let me vote for this party or that party, then you realize, oh my God, even though there's some differences here about abortion or immigration or these kind of things, these other big issues progress: war, surveillance state, Federal Reserve debt, et cetera, et cetera. And that was, I think, so important. I really think that the Trump deception, that Trump wrecked people's brains in more ways than one. But I mean, specifically, I'm not talking about, left-wing people screaming Russia, Russia, Russia or whatever, but even people who claim to be in the freedom movement, the liberty movement, whatever, who here, still 8 years later, are making excuses for people like Trump and completely forgot that things like the Bilderberg Group exist and that they fund both sides of the party. And not only that, but of course the Zionists. I mean, Sheldon Adelson, he's dead and gone, but his wife and his family continue to fund Donald Trump. And of course, through J.D. Vance, as well as directly with Trump, Peter Thiel funding his campaign in 2016 and continuing to support this time. Peter Thiel is a steering committee member of the Bilderberg Group. And as I pointed out there in my Bitcoin article, I was also talking about the connections between Peter Thiel, Rumble, the Bitcoin community, how they're, I can sort of see this approach of they're choosing these different demographics, what I call the predator class. They're choosing these different demographics that they know will be helpful for creating this illusion of populism. So, for example, the crypto community, which tends to be, counterculture, alternative. A lot of people thinking about like getting outside the Federal Reserve. Not everybody, but as I made the point in that article, a lot of people just bought into the idea that Bitcoin is just a way to get rich. But they're taking these people from that community, and especially people from that community who currently see the Biden administration is coming hard after crypto. And now Trump's saying he's going to be the crypto president. He's making all these promises, right? So you kind of pull in that demographic, and then he makes enough. He throws a couple of bones to the conspiracy community. Oh, I'm going to look into the JFK files, and maybe we'll look at Epstein if it doesn't harm too many people. And now, of course, this latest thing with pulling in RFK, which was largely, of course, supported by the health freedom movement, pulling in that demographic, you start to get this illusion that there's this truly populist movement that is rising up to fight against the Democrat, communist, etc. And I just don't understand why people are being so dismissive when I point out that, as I did in my previous article, that Eric Schmidt, also a steering committee member of the Bilderberg Group, former CEO of Google, that he's going all in on Harris, and some of the other alleged left-leaning big tech bros are doing the same. And even just this last week, I saw the New York Times did an interview with Alex Karp, who's the other Palantir co-founder along with Peter Thiel, and he's saying he's going all in on Harris. And guess what? Alex Karp is also a steering committee member of the Bilderberg Group. So you've got 3 different steering committee members of the Bilderberg Group, Peter Thiel, Eric Schmidt, and Alex Karp, taking different sides, if we're to believe that. And either way, no matter how you look at it, the Zionists are supporting both sides, the Israeli lobby supporting both sides, the Bilderberg Group and all that they represent, which I think is the true power, the true hidden power, the people they actually, not just the people who attend those meetings, but the people who the interests that they actually represent and that they continue to keep secret, are funding both sides of this equation. And in this new article, I was pointing at America's Frontier Fund, which is just another piece of the puzzle that I felt was important to point out, because you can clearly see within that again, there's this tie between Peter Thiel and Eric Schmidt. Both of them are funding this America's Frontier Fund. So again, steering committee members of the Bilderberg Group, Schmidt, as I've pointed out in my last 2 articles, deeply tied into the Biden White House, but also was deeply tied into the Trump White House. He had complete and full access. He was the chair of the AI Commission. And then once that AI Commission ended in 2021, he continues to have influence in the White House, including through startups that he's funding like Rebellion Defense. And overall, this America's Frontier Fund, what I was gathering from it, this is a public-private partnership, if you will, because all of these folks are tied to private money, but they're also connected to U.S. military and U.S. intelligence, and they're developing the AI policy for the future. So there's a mix of they're able to take their own private money and direct it to projects that they're also privately invested in using taxpayer funds. So it's just this incestuous relationship where they come out of working for the U.S. government, AI Commission, they're funding both parties, then they fund this public-private deep tech fund that is going to advise the U.S. on where to make investments using taxpayer dollars, and through that, they're able to steer those taxpayer dollars towards companies that they are invested in. So, I mean, you have the sort of financial corruption level of just like, okay, it's just, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But it's also deeper than that, because we know who these people are connected to. We know that Palantir is helping the Israelis. We know that Palantir works with the CIA. We know that all these people are connected to the Bilderberg Group and that they're funding both sides of the equation. And so this is just beyond frustrating for me to see that so many people want to ignore these things. They want to ignore that RFK, is going after Trump and supporting him despite Trump continuing to champion the vaccine that RFK claimed to be fighting against. And that all 3 of these people, Harris, Trump, and RFK, are Zionists and turning a blind eye to dead Palestinian children. And they're convincing so many people out there who believe or pretend to care about liberty and freedom to say, okay, maybe they're doing that. Maybe they're being funded by the Bilderberg Group. Maybe they're being funded by the Israelis. Maybe they're supporting dead children, etc. But we have to stop Harris. And so I just think this is a total co-opting, even further co-opting of the freedom movement and just redirecting people's energy towards Trump. And I think it will be much easier for them to advance technocracy with the Trump administration because so many people will continue to make these excuses.
Right. And then, of course, we've got the Elon Musk overlap as well, who, it's none of it's really fleshed out entirely, but it looks like as if they're at least floating that he might join the administration as well. And, I recently just looked at the updated release through the lawsuit that happened of all the people that are actually supporting financially Twitter, which we didn't know entirely until just recently. And there's, Oracle, or rather the person behind Oracle, Sequoia Capital, like all these different things that are invested with either like Israeli startups or surveillance aspects of, it's all this kind of similar blob of technocracy. And it's very alarming to see how just the political ideology is enough to hide that from certain people. Or like it's almost like they've convinced, it's like, with the phone idea that, a long time ago, they're like, how can we surveil these people without them knowing? We'll get them to do it themselves. We'll get you to buy the phone, put it in your pocket. Now people are choosing to do these things to themselves because of this political ideology. It's kind of the way this all works. And it's disconcerting at the very least. And I think with the RFK aspect of it, the point is that what you're highlighting there, and I think what irritates people that can't see past the paradigm is they then perceive it as you or I or people in this position fighting for the other side, because that's the only way it can make sense in their mind when that's not what's really happening. At least as I perceive it, and I think we have slightly different, maybe we don't, you could tell me, but that I perceive this as this is our government deciding the next selection. And then if that's, and that I could be wrong and people can disagree, but so my perspective is that Trump is the one they're trying to push in. And I think everything aligns with Trump right now, everything from the DNC, everything. And so that to me is just trying to highlight to people out there listening that I think that this is the problem, but not that the left is the other solution, but just simply that they're lying to us about this. Or even if that's not the way you perceive it, simply that what we're showing is something that you should care about either way. Like you made the point about fluoride and personalizing it. It's obvious why people are personalizing this and obviously the agenda around it. That's why this is all happening. It's part of the agenda to get you to invest in them as a person. But the problem is that they then ignore the obvious that this person has something. They've lied about this. They pushed the injection and they just choose to ignore it because team sport politics. Like that is a cult. I mean, I don't even know how better to frame that. You are acting against your interest because you've decided you're on this team, and so this is what you're highlighting is that we're out there trying to go, hey, we should care about these things. And all you get is what? You just want Kamala to win? And it's like, it's exhausting.
I can't tell you the amount of times I've been told that over the last few days, man. And again, like going back to, I guess it was just,
go ahead.
Exactly. And I guess it was just me being naive, or I don't know what, I mean, it's a combination of things. Maybe I overestimated the amount of people who really got it, right? And at the same time, I do think as we progress towards, I've been reporting on this as well, we're 30 days away from the Summit of the Future, and the United Nations is about to sign a pact for the future and potentially declare a planetary emergency, only a month or so before the U.S. election. And we know that more than likely when the U.S. election comes, both sides, whoever loses in this charade is going to claim some kind of, something screwy happened. We're already being prepped, as I've been reporting on my channel, on my website. You may have seen it, Ryan. I'm sure you have, that now Microsoft and the U.S. government are claiming they have evidence that Iran is hacking the U.S. election, that they hacked Trump's campaign, and they're trying to hack the Harris campaign. We're kind of already being prepped for some sort of election screwiness, and maybe not. Maybe this time it'll just be, the story will be a blowout win for Trump, and the idea is that, yes, we all came together, RFK, Trump, Musk, Carlson, everybody united together and defeated the communists. That could be the narrative. But for me, the point is that people do truly, once again, personalize this themselves. Like if they hear me be critical of Trump or RFK, they take that as a personal attack. And I think this is a deeper part of the programming that, and what I was saying a moment ago is that as we progress closer to Agenda 2030, I do think the programming is going to get more intense. It's going to get worse, that the times more than likely will get more divisive. And people like us who are like, look, guys, I don't know, I don't think this makes sense, are going to get more attacked. We are going to be, the vitriol against us is going to be at levels I don't think we've ever seen, because we're going to be the ones pointing out the flaws in the system, while everybody else is trying to say, no, we've won, we've achieved this. This is what I've been referring to as the great inversion, this sort of belief that we're moving out of darkness into some new light, like the goodness is winning. But I believe it is a false light that's being presented to us with these characters of Musk and obviously Trump, and then now RFK joining that whole faction. And at the end of the day, I think people just need to be able to step back and realize that we are not the government. I am not bombing children in Palestine. I'm not pouring poison into the tap water, and neither are you. Neither is anybody at home listening to this. We need to disconnect our identities from these characters. That's what they want. They want you to identify with them. Like when Trump says, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you, and I'm just standing in the way. It's meant to indicate to people that like he's our savior, he's our protector. And yeah, I mean, he even got protected. They almost tried to kill him, but by the grace of God, he's here. All this stuff is meant to create this cult of personality and make people identify with Trump personally. Like, so when he's attacked, I'm being attacked. When he wins, I win. What's good for him is good for me. And what's bad for me, I'll just ignore that because, well, he's my guy, right? It really is a psychological operation. This is part of that 5th generation warfare that we talked about with the ND Media panel a few weeks ago. And this is what really does disturb me, because I only believe this is going to get worse as we progress through this, that the layers of deception, the true 5D chess that they're working against us, not the like Trump's here to save the day, just wait, everything's going to, the white hats are coming to save the day type 5D chess, but the 5th generation warfare meant to not only divide us, but to confuse us, to distract us, to delay us, and to disrupt our movements is absolutely increasing. And I think that is what we're witnessing. That's why when somebody like me or you and others out there who still have their brains together point out the flaws, we're getting attacked. We're being called black-pilled. And this is happening to me, not only just from, random people on the internet, but from people I know in my own life, like people who I've met, hung out with, real people who I know aren't bots, who are like, I don't know, Derrick, you just seem negative. You just seem like you're just cynical, etc. And so the truth is now being equated with being negative, with being black-pilled, with being cynical, when all we're saying is perhaps we should care that both sides are being funded by the same players. Maybe that's something we should pay attention to. Or perhaps we should care if somebody who claims to defend children's health is justifying the killing of Palestinian children, right? Like, these are things that I don't think we should just breeze past and dismiss as if it's just like, oh, he has a personality quirk. No, we're talking about people who are justifying and supporting the literal killing of human beings and supporting policies which will, I think, in the long term lead to more killing of human beings. And
on top of that, endorsing the person who still argues the injection is helping people. Coming from medical health, it just doesn't, and I mean, I went off on it last night at the show. I think what you said there is a perfect place to end on this. You said that very well, Derrick. And I think the problem, it's like principles don't matter anymore. At least as long as, we have our principles, but if this gets in the way of the two-party, the winning dynamic, the team sport politics, then you're childish, naive for acting like we should care about our principles. It's just like, it's just inversion, like you're saying. It's impossible. And I don't want to believe that most people are falling for that. I'd like to believe that most people are intelligent enough to recognize that the last thing you should be compromising on is your integrity and your principles, especially when it comes into somebody, that he embodies everything that is the opposite of what he's putting forward, whether it's RFK or anything else. It's the same thing I said with Bernie Sanders and Clinton, and the same damn thing is that you can't talk about this momentum and change and the new idea that, breaking this and then fall into the system and act like that in any way is benefiting anything but the system. Now, he may think that's the right move. I'm never going to say I know what his intentions are, but to me, that was a failure. He's throwing away what people gave him. I
think he's selling out. I mean, I think he's selling out. And like you said, we don't know his own motivations, because the arguments I'm seeing is like, well, Trump said that if he wins, he's going to give him, he's going to put him at the head of the CIA, and that'll really stick it to the libs, or he's going to put him at the head of the Health and Human Services. Or I watched after RFK abandoned his campaign and then he went to go campaign for Trump, and the reports are basically saying that in the coming weeks he's going to be out there stumping for Trump. So it's not just like he's suspending his campaign, he's full on like going in for this dude. And okay, Trump tells him, I'm going to start a new commission to investigate all the assassinations, including for his uncle and his father. Now that's got to be hard to turn down, like assuming he's just a human being and he's not corrupted and the Epstein ties and all this stuff. If he really is a well-intentioned guy and somebody's coming along and saying, look, I'm going to give you the opportunity to join my administration. We're going to create a commission. We're going to get to the bottom of your dad's assassination and to your uncle's assassination. I'm not in that position. I can't imagine what that would feel like. And maybe that is too hard of a potential to pass up, even though all the things we pointed out. We know that, okay, well, this guy's promoting the vaccine still. This guy's been a liar his whole life, etc. But to me, those of us who are not in those shoes, we can at least step back and say, we understand Trump's record. He's got 4 years in the office. We saw he lied and broke all kinds of promises. He is known to be a liar. And I know that's still hard for Trump supporters to admit, but I mean, this guy is a pathological liar. I don't see why you would put any weight into what he says. But still, yes, I don't claim to know RFK's true motivations. I just know from my perspective, like you said, with Bernie and with all these other sort of third-party heroes running the insurgent campaigns, in the end, they always bow the knee to one of the two parties. And right now people are saying, well, the DNC was trying to screw him over, so of course he should go to the other side. But I guarantee you, if RFK chose to run in the Republican Party, they would have done the same thing to him. The RNC would have done the exact same thing to him. It's not like they're somehow magically absolved of being corrupted as well. So that's just back into that whole fake left-right paradigm. Well, the DNC screwed him, so he's going to the other side to support the populist movement. The RNC would have done the same thing if they felt he was a threat. And that's why, in fact, Trump and the Republicans were talking crap about Kennedy throughout the campaign for a good period of time once they saw him as a threat. But ultimately, they were able to bring him over to their side. So now he's their best buddy, and that's politics as usual.
I still don't know if, for me, it's hard not to see it as like the way this was meant to go. But I'll end with the point that, but the thing I really wanted people to hear in my show yesterday was that for me, regardless of what you think about him and whether you think this is an honest choice or not, his explanation was very well put. He laid it out. It's hard to deny the logic of what he's saying. My point, though, is that if we truly want something different, which was the spirit behind his campaign, the reason that he talked about people walking in the snow and getting donations with their lunch money that they just dumped into Trump's hands, by the way, that the reason people went through that process was because they believed that he was trying to change the dynamic, right? So the problem is that if we really want that, how can we possibly pretend like this is going to change the system? The point should be like as VP was saying, keep going, try to reach 5%, try to get the new party dynamic going, try to get the unlocked funds that might be going, even if you lose this dynamic, even if you think that takes away from, you think Trump would have won or whatever, change it for the future, get the cycle going. Let's lean into this different, the path continually instead of just flirting with it and then just falling into the party every single time. I can't see, like, my point, if we want to stay stuck in this cycle, that's the choice we should be making. And I think everybody truly knows that in their heart. Frankly, most of the people that are probably very disillusioned right now based on how that just happened, they're probably the same people. They're saying the same thing, but they're screaming into the wind because the only voices being heard right now are the ones tapping into the left and the right, which is the whole problem, So I agree with you, man. And I think you explained it very well. So hopefully people can wake up to this. Hopefully we can make some real positive change happen around the system that's meant to keep us stuck in the mud. That's what I can say. And I think that's where we need to be putting our action into. Anything else you want to leave us with on the way out, Derrick? Other notes of hopeful change?
Just thanks again for bringing me on. And to everybody who's been following the Fluoride story, I do appreciate the support. I see the messages and I'm glad you guys are paying attention. Please continue to share this with your families. In terms of the Bilderberg influence, just keep shouting it from the rooftops. You guys know that I don't really see hope in politics, and this is exactly why. Because as you said, Ryan, they ultimately capitulate and they give in to one of the two-party system, and we're not going to get to real, true lasting change that involves respecting individual liberty, bodily autonomy, freedom of speech, etc., by continuing to play that game. So I just offer that anybody who is kind of on the fence and thinking, yeah, I hear you guys, but Harris is, worse or whatever, just recognize that these people have control of that system. That doesn't mean that there's no hope. That doesn't mean that you should be black-pilled and apathetic and all is lost. It simply means that trying that same thing over and over, banging your head against that wall and expecting new results is not the solution. Instead, I think we should look to our own communities and our own neighborhoods to find the real solutions. And if each of us put more energy into what's going on our local level, each of us around the world, then we will see a better world. It might take some time and it's not going to come by November, But that's the real work, not giving away your power, outsourcing your power to politicians who have proven time and time again that they do not deserve our trust.
I love it. Well said. I think the core point is that, we're not going to find a political solution in this control dynamic, as well as the fact that it is possible to find a political solution outside of that. And we should be looking toward that. The problem is people get trapped in this to think that the only thing we can do to change it is working through that. I think that's the illusion in and of itself. And that we bring up these other options and they go, but you're just checking out. And it's like, we need to expand our understanding of these things. Whether it's the Overton window or however you want to look at it, we need to start thinking differently about how we can, even whether it's through the system or not. So Derrick, your work is always very appreciated, both for TLAV as well as the conscious resistance. So thank you for all you're doing. And everybody out there, as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.